This video describes how to do categorical data graphs. So again, we're at the point where we have some data now and we want to figure out how to summarize it to either do some exploratory data analysis or to just communicate some basic results to people. And so how we summarize depends on what kinds of data we have. Currently, we're working with strictly categorical data. And numerically, we saw that we're just going to use contingency tables to summarize categorical data numerically. In terms of graphically, generally what we're going to do is just a bar plots and variations on bar plots. So there is a bar plot function in R that works very well, but we're not going to utilize that one. We're actually going to utilize the ggplot2 package, which is part of the tidyverse. And the reason is that we want to sort of stay in that same universe that we've been learning. And this is kind of a more modern way to create your graphs. And these have tons of nice options. They do a lot of the sort of background work for you. And they're going to be sort of publication or say if you're creating a blog or blog post or whatever, it's going to be ready to go as soon as you create them. Okay. And so there is a cheat sheet that we're going to reference as we go here. And this may look a little bit crazy, but the basic idea is that there are different types of plots you can make, and they show you those over here. And so, if you have one variable and you're dealing with continuous data, these are the types of plots you might make, and they give you brief examples. We're dealing with categorical data, which they actually refer to as discrete, which I don't love, but it is what it is. So we're going to be doing geom bar, so we're going to be doing bar plots through ggplot2. When we start talking about numerical data, we'll go over here. When we start talking about more than one variable as well, we'll go over here into these regions and look at the types of plots we can make there. So how do we get started with ggplot2? What do we need to know? Well, you start with the ggplot function and you give it the data frame or tibble that you want to work on. And essentially what that ggplot function does is it just creates a coordinate system. So sort of specifies, say, an x and a y variable kind of idea. And then what you do is you add layers to that coordinate system. And the layers are usually one of these types of plots. So this geom bar would be a geom bar layer is what they would refer to it as. There could be a geom box plot layer, so a box plot geom layer. And so each one of those layers has its own little set of mappings that you might add on top of sort of just your XY kind of ideas. And so we'll go through some examples here of how to do that with bar plots. And again, we'll keep going with ggplot2 when we do numerical summaries. All right, so what are the needs of the ggplot function? Well, we need a data frame to have our data in. We need aesthetics, or AES, and this is going to be the mappings of the variables within our data set to properties of the geom, so properties of the graph that we're going to be creating. And so the most common ones that you're going to deal with are, say, x and y. If you think about like a scatter plot, one variable needs to be assigned to x, one needs to be assigned to y. You might want to color code those by another variable or have the size of the plot points depend on a variable. So anytime that you're dealing with mapping variables in your data set to one of these properties, that goes into an AES statement, so an aesthetic statement. Beyond that, we need to know what kind of geom layer we're dealing with. So are we doing a bar plot, we're doing a scatter plot, all those kinds of things. We need to figure out which geom layer. And we don't really need to specify this, but there are options for changing your coordinate system. Instead of using your sort of Cartesian plane, you can use polar coordinates and other things like that. And then once you sort of have your base graph down, you can then add optional layers such as a title layer. You can change your axes labels and things like that as well. So again, this might seem a little bit confusing at first, but once you start seeing it, it's not so bad. So here would be the start of a box plot or the start of a plot. Okay, so a generic statement here. So the way that people generally do this is they use ggplot to create a base plotting object. And so you give it the data frame that you're working with and some basic aesthetics that are going to be common across all of the layers that you're going to add. So the most common things are like x and y, right? And usually what you do is you save that as a temporary object. And then what you would do is you take that object and you would add layers, and you actually use the plus sign in this case to add layers to it. So we would take our base plotting object G and we would add a particular geom type from that cheat sheet. And we might need to assign some aesthetics just for that particular layer. And then you could add another layer on top of that, and then maybe some labels, and then maybe another title and things like that. That's the general process. You use ggplot function, specify sort of an initial plotting object, and then you save that somewhere and you start adding layers. So you add your graph type on top of that. All right, so let's stick with this Titanic data set that we used for the numerical summaries, and we'll stick with some of the same variables. So we're going to deal with the embarked variable, the survived variable, and the sex variable. So we might start with an initial plotting object. So we might say ggplot. Again, we have to have ggplot2 package installed and read in. So ggplot, give it the data frame we want to work with. And then since we just want a bar plot of one variable in this particular instance, we just need to assign the aesthetic of what variable is going to be on the x-axis. So we'll say AES for aesthetic. This is a variable from my data set, embarked, and I'm going to set that to be x. And so you might think this will make me a nice plot, but remember, this is just a base plotting object that is essentially setting up your coordinate system. Okay? So it said, oh, you wanted the embarked variable on the x-axis. Done. That's the only aesthetic you gave me. That's the only information I have. So this is your base plotting object. And now the idea is that you can just add layers on top of this thing. So you can add the plot layer, you can add title layer, and sort of build up your plot from there. And so there's really this entire sort of framework, this entire thought process that goes into this ggplot2 package. ggplot actually stands for Grammar of Graphics. So Hadley Wickham, the guy that wrote this, he actually read a book and he really loved this book about how to build plots from the ground up. So he wrote this entire package based off of that. So again, the idea here would be to take that base plotting object and save it, and then just add the layers that you want to. So we're going to add a geom bar layer. And since we've already described the aesthetic that's going to work for that geom bar, we don't need to redefine it down here. This is really like a global aesthetic that we're assigning up here. And if we did an AES statement within here, that would be a local one that would overwrite any type of global assignment of aesthetics. Okay. And so again, we don't need to put one here because we already have the global assignment that X is going to be embarked. And now by adding this geom bar layer, it's going to know, okay, what you want me to do is actually create a bar plot. So this is what you'd end up with from those two lines of code. Okay, so of course, I mean, this is a fine plot. It gets the point across, but you know, having like say C down here and Q, that's not super intuitive. I have a column with an NA. I don't really like that. That's not super useful for me. So how might we improve this? Well, let's start by say dropping the NA. So within the, I think this is within the dplyr package, there's a drop NA function. So I'm just going to overwrite Titanic data set with the Titanic data where I've dropped any NA rows that had an NA for embarked. Remember that NA is that special missing value indicator for R. So I have a new data set that has no more NAs for all of the observations where embarked. So we're going to keep all the observations where embarked has a value. And so I'm just going to run that same exact code on that new data set. And so that gets rid of that last category. Cool. Let's maybe add some better labels in a title. So let's check out our cheat sheet, right? We want to add labeling and titles. So let's start with labels. So this first part of the cheat sheet is really all about the types of graphs you can make. And on the second half, this is where you get into sort of scales. So this is changing your the values that show up on your axes and whatnot. Coordinate system you can change, faceting for creating multiple graphs across another variable. But over here is labs. So labels, that's where we want to be. So again, the idea is that you have your base plotting object. And what we're doing is we're adding a layer, a label layer in this case. So the function to do that is labs. And we can add things like an X label, Y label, title, subtitle, caption, and so on. So the code that we used for that is here. So labs, we have a new X label and a new title for our graph. So that particular line changes what you see up here and down here. Now, the other thing that you notice has changed here is actually the labelings on our bar plot categories. So to do that, we will reference the cheat sheet over here. So scales, we want to change the actual labels that we have on our, say, x-axis. And so remember that discrete is the way that they reference categorical data. So what we want to do is change the discrete scale mappings. And so they put a star here to represent, well, you need to tell me which layer you're referring to, because remember you can have multiple plot layers on here. So we want the actual X aesthetic. I said that wrong. So this star represents which one of our aesthetics that we want to access. So we're saying scale, and then the aesthetic we want to change is the X scale. And so we're going to do scale X discrete and then give it the appropriate labels. So we know we have 3 categories for that, so we're just going to name them appropriately. Cool. So now we have a much better looking graph. All right, so that's if you have a single categorical variable. So that's akin to looking at a one-way table, right? Just graphically. If we have multiple categorical variables, we can do variations on the bar plot. One would be a filled bar plot. Another would be a side-by-side bar plot. And the general process is the same. And this is what's kind of nice about the ggplot2 package. We're going to do the same idea. We're going to have a base plotting object. We're going to add layers to it. We're going to use the AES or aesthetic to specify the different attributes of the plot. So if I want a filled bar plot, which this is what we mean by a filled bar plot, each one of the bars is actually filled with a color to represent another variable. I can go into my bar layer and I can change the aesthetic for fill. And so the way to know what aesthetics are available for that particular layer, you can either reference the cheat sheet, or of course the help file would be more verbose. It would give all of the options, but the common options that you would change, the common aesthetics you would change for geom bar are given here. So fill is the one that's going to fill the bars. And since we want to fill the bars based off of a variable within our data set, this needs to go within an aesthetic. We're saying geom bar layer, and then a new aesthetic would be to fill the bars by this survived variable. And so I've changed the survived variable to a factor because ggplot2 works better with factors. And the really great thing about ggplot is that it will automatically create legends for us. So in base R plotting, you had to do all of your legends and all of this color coding yourself. Here, you just have nice options and it will automatically create things for you. And so it creates this legend over here where 0 is an indicator of not surviving and 1 surviving. So again, this would be a filled bar plot. So of course, we probably want to change the label for this legend. That doesn't seem very nice to us. So we can do that using the same kind of layer idea here. So I have my base plotting layer. I've added my geom bar that specifies I want a filled bar plot. I have my labels for my title and whatnot, for my scale X. And now I'm going to change my fill attribute, right? So again, discrete, since we're working with this geom bar, and then fill is the aesthetic that I want to change the scale for, right? And so I'm saying that I want the name for this to be survived and the labels to be no and yes. And so you got to look up in the help, what these things are called. But this is the general idea for how to change the axes labels and the different aesthetic labels that are automatically created. You would go into the cheat sheet and figure out which aesthetic you're dealing with, and then what the names are for the things that you want to change. So we run that and we see that the label over there has changed, much more useful for us. Just to show you some other things that you can do, we talked about the coordinate plane and the fact that you can change that in ggplot pretty easily. So one thing that you might want to do with, say, a bar plot would be make it a sideways bar plot instead. And so you just add a coordinate flip layer, and that just turns it on its side. And so all that kind of information is available over here. We have a chord flip. You can change it to polar if that's appropriate, and all these other kinds of things. One confusing thing that can kind of come up every once in a while is that there's actually an alternative way to create your plotting layers. So you can use these geom layers, or you can actually use what's called a stat layer to create your graphs instead. And so when you first start learning this, and maybe you are trying to Google examples, sometimes people use stat layers, sometimes people use geom layers, and that can be a little bit confusing. So let's talk about that for just a second. Most of the geoms that you use are going to have an equivalent way to do it with what's called a stat layer. And so if you look at the geom bar function call, so there's mapping, data, and you actually see that the corresponding stat that's used in geom bar is count. And so if you go to the cheat sheet, you go over here to the top left of the second page, there's actually stats, an alternative way to build a layer. And so this builds new variables to our plot. And so, for instance, we can take our base plotting object and add a count layer to it. And that's going to be equivalent then to doing a geom bar. And actually talks about this here, right? And so these two plot calls are actually going to be equivalent. So whether I add a geom bar layer, so a bar plot layer, or whether I add a stat count layer, those are essentially the same exact thing. Sometimes the options that you will then plug in will be a little bit different though. So by and large, I tend to use just the geom layers rather than the stat layers, but you can certainly do both. Another thing that you should know about for that stat layer, so notice that this is the default is count, but that does mean that there are possibly other options for it, right? So sometimes, especially with trying to make bar plots, you might not have the raw data, but maybe you have summary data instead. So here, we're going to create a new data frame that's actually summary data about the embarked and survived variables. So this is essentially a two-way table. So let's just make sure we see and understand what that data looks like. So we're taking that Titanic data set, and then we're making it grouped by embarked and survived. And remember, by grouping it, we then know that this summarize function will find the summary for each one of those combinations of those group levels. And so the combination that I'm grabbing, or the summary statistics I'm creating, is going to be the count. So n is this way to create that count. Some data looks like this. This is a sort of flattened looking two-way table, right? So I have my, oh, sorry, I didn't remove my NAs. Let me make sure I do that. Well, anyway, you get the point though, right? So we would essentially have this data that we're dealing with, and we want to create a bar plot based off of this summary data set where we don't have the raw counts. And so that can be done by just changing our stat layer, or sorry, our stat that we're using within our geom layer. If I look at geom bar, right, so we have this stat option here. We go down, say what other things can I do with stat? So stat, this overrides the default connection between geom bar and stat count. So remember, count was the one that basically produces that bar plot from raw data. And so we can replace it with one of these other stats instead. And actually, whenever you have the summary data already created, we don't really need ggplot to create any summaries for us. We don't need it to calculate anything. And so we give it the stat equal identity to say, I already have the statistic that I want to plot. Just plot what I give you. Okay. So just to run through the rest of this code, we're creating a base plotting object G2 using our summary data. We're saying that the X variable should be embarked, and our Y variable, now we actually have the summaries already, so we're saying the Y variable should be count. And then we're going to add a bar layer where we're still going to fill them by survived, but we're then going to say, well, you don't need to calculate anything, you don't need to summarize anything, just use the stat that's given here for your Y variable. And so that would produce that same plot that we looked at here, just without the prettier labelings for the legend. Okay, another thing that you might want to do is, instead of doing a filled bar plot, maybe you do a side-by-side bar plot. That's kind of a very standard categorical data summary. And so there are position arguments that you can look at. And some of the options for the position argument are dodge, jitter, fill, or stack. And so what these things do are described right here. So dodge means that instead of being on each other, they're dodging each other. So they're missing each other. That's how to represent a side-by-side bar plot. So that's what we're going to do in this particular case. So we're going to go ahead and add that as an option to our geom bar layer. But one thing to notice is that our AES statement, our aesthetics, that ends right here, right? So remember that AES, the only things that you put in the AES are things that depend on a variable within your data set. So position equals dodge is an option on geom bar, but it's not a mapping of the data set to something, right? This is just an option on that bar. So this will go outside of the AES state. And so what that does is it just makes those bars next to each other. They dodge, they miss. You can change it to position equal fill. That was one of those other options. This one's not necessarily great because this will sort of give you the proportions of each within, but we don't know how many, there are way more people that came on the Southampton port than the other ones. So this kind of loses that information, but sometimes this can be useful. And so, those are kind of the major things that you're going to do with just strictly categorical data in terms of plotting. And so maybe you've created a really nice plot. You now want to save it somewhere. How do we do it? Well, we already know how to save, say, a two-way table to a file with write_CSV or write_table. That's how you can just save data. But if you wanted to save your plot itself, there are a couple ways. One, you can do it programmatically, and this is what I would recommend. So there's this ggSave function that will save the most recently created ggplot that you've done. So all you got to do is give the file name where you want to output it to, and it will create the appropriate type of file based off of your extension that you give it. Alternatively, there's the export button that will pop, that's up there in the plots viewer. So you can go export, save as image or PDF, and then do it through menus. This is less reproducible, right? So knowing exactly what you did here, especially in terms of setting the width and height, that's something that you wouldn't be able to recreate necessarily. Whereas if you did this through code, you could specify the width and height here and make sure that everything is exactly reproducible. So I always recommend, if you can do it programmatically, do it programmatically. Okay, so we are done analyzing and summarizing just strictly categorical data. What we're going to do next is step into having quantitative data and then quantitative and categorical together. And we'll stick with the ggplot package for plotting because it does a lot of the fun stuff for us.